Hello, lords and ladies. Here's a topic I get asked about a lot, and so I thought I'd create a little helpful video to guide you through the process of setting up your live projects and sets for sharing with other people. Whether you're collaborating on a track with somebody else, or you're sending it to someone for a mixdown, the process for sharing your projects with somebody else can be a little bit complicated. So we here at Warp Academy have come up with our own conventions for getting this done. And while it may seem like a rather cumbersome process, I think you'll find that all of these points make a lot of sense. So these are some best practices that we've come up with, and you can use this list as a simple checklist before you go ahead and share your project. I'm going to go through each one of these in detail, and you'll be able to come back to this video as many times as necessary. While different friends and producers may have their own set of preferences for doing this same task, I think that you'll find if you incorporate a lot of these techniques into your track making as a matter of course, they will all become second nature to you in no time. All right, let's get started. The first thing I'm going to do with this set is to save it to another location. And this way I'm going to have a copy to work with that is suitable for sharing. So I'm going to do a save live set as. I'm going to pick somewhere handy like, say, the desktop. And from here, I'd like to name the project. Remember, when you're doing a save as to a new location, although it says ALS here on the end, what you're actually saving is an entire project folder, a brand new project folder. And what I'd like you to use for naming your projects is first your name. In this case, I'm going to pretend I'm Ian Gallagher, one of our other trainers whose song this is. And then use his artist name, in this case, the identifiers, and finally the name of the song, which is, in this case, Celebrity Pass. I'm going to save that to the desktop. So that is your name, artist name, if any, or if it's different from your own name. If you don't have one, that's fine. You can just use your name and the song name. And I'm going to hit save. Now here we are inside of the new project folder, and you can see I've got a set with the same name as the project. If you need to identify this set as some version number for your own clarification, or if for some unlikely reason you might need to include more than one set, simply put a V and a number after it at the end of your set name. Let's say this is the 9th version of your song. You can put a V9 on there, and that'll just help you remember that the one that you're sharing was version 9, because you may continue working on it yourself on your own elsewhere, or you just wanted to know which version you shared with someone else. So putting version 9 in there is fine. Next, I'd like to have you name all of your tracks so that none of them are named Audio 27 or MIDI 13 or anything like that, but with as descriptive a name as you can. And you'll see how these are all named accordingly. While you're doing this, you should also delete any unused tracks. If there are tracks just sitting there that don't have any clips on them, delete them. If they're a track with something on it that didn't make it into the final mix, delete it. The only instance where you might want to include a track that's not playing is during the freeze and flatten process. And I'll talk about that in a moment. But generally speaking, if it's not playing, if it's not included in the mix, delete it. The same goes for clips. If you have clips on the timeline that are deactivated and there's no good reason to include them, you should probably delete them. Next, you'll notice my elaborate bussing and coloring methodology here, and this is important. At the top level of the set, you'll notice that all I have is group tracks, and that's very handy for organization. I've named each of my group tracks with capital letters followed by group, and I've also color-coded them as well as the tracks that they contain. And this color coding is a convenient form of standardization that I've come to in my own work that just makes some logical sense. Generally speaking, we start at the lower frequencies and work our way up to the higher frequencies, higher in the list. So I've got drums at the bottom in red. The bass group is blue, B for blue. Guitar is green, G for green. I've separated my synth elements into 3 logical groups here, and this may not apply to every single set that you're working in, but this is a great scenario. Think about synths that play a pad role, strings, sustained, long, spacious, those type of sounds, in a group called synth pad. A group called synth pulse that's more for arpeggiated sounds or staccato rhythmic sounds. And then if you have a lead sound, it may be some combination of pulse or pad, but if it's a really important front synth element separate from those other 2, then you may want to isolate it into its own group. The effects group is for risers, fallers, cymbal hits, any one-time effects that happen here or there, and those should go in their own group. And then if you have any vocals, whether they're samples or recorded vocals, backing vocals, they should probably all go into a group. If you have an elaborate vocal mix where you have backing vocals separate from the lead vocals, it'd be perfectly okay to put those in a subgroup. These aren't the end-all be-all. These are just a logical way for this particular project. And if you see something that makes a lot more sense for your project, you can diverge from this where it makes sense for you. Obviously, if you don't have any guitars, you don't need to include a guitar group, etc., etc. You'll also notice that I have a group at the bottom called reference group, and that it's gray and it's deactivated. I like to color code anything with this dark gray color that should not be playing during the playback of the mix, but might be useful for one reason or another. So for example, I had previously shown you that there was this amber flat, which is not supposed to be playing. And so it's muted here. The track activator is turned off and the track is gray. Likewise, for the reference group, you wouldn't want these to play while the mixing is being done, but there's useful things in here and they can be soloed and played at any time. So for example, it's important that you include a reference mix. That means you exported this particular set in this project to a WAV file and then re-imported that mix into your set and put it on the timeline in time with the rest of your mix. So at any point, I can solo your reference mix track and check to see if my version of your tracks and your reference mix sound the same, and they should. This can help me discover whether or not I'm missing a particular plugin or a particular patch for a plugin, or whether an effect setting is different on my end, things like that. Also, if you're including your own reference tracks, meaning tracks that you think your track could sound like, some pro track that you like the sound of that you think is kind of in the same world as what you're going for, you can throw those in here as well. This makes it very easy when you're coming to the end of the process and you want to A/B against some known reference. This way I know better what you're going for. You'll notice as well that there are some locators here sectioning off the track. And this isn't critical, but it's certainly helpful so that if we're communicating about a particular section of the song, you don't always have to use bar numbers. You can say, oh, the drop that happens in chorus 3 is too loud, or something along those lines. But it's a handy way for us to have a roadmap of all the different parts of your song. And this is about right in terms of the number of them. Anytime there's a major shift in the track, that makes some sense to put a locator. Next, I'd have you turn off warping for any tracks that don't need it. So if you recorded the track into your set at the current set tempo, then there's no need for warping to be on. Likewise, if you've frozen or flattened a track, those tracks should all be set to warp off. In fact, every clip on your timeline should be set to warp off unless there's a reason for it not to be. That just cleans up the audio quality quite a bit and turns off any unnecessary CPU intensive tasks. Likewise, I'd like you to delete any unused plugins. So for example, if I have a plugin on a track that's off, maybe it's something you tried once and decided against later on, get rid of them. There's no good reason to keep extra plugins on a track when you're not going to use them. If they are automated and they turn on and off, that's another story altogether, obviously. But if they're not serving any purpose, delete them. Personally, I'd ask that you delete any Spectrum plugins that you're including, or any plugins that aren't doing anything. If you've got a utility plugin on a track and it's not actually doing anything, making any kind of gain or pan or width or phase adjustments, it doesn't really need to be there. So delete it. It may seem like a little thing, but when you're diving through a new set for the first time and trying to get your brain around what's happening in it, the fewer plugins to grok, the better. All right, this is probably the most complicated part of this entire process, so you'll want to pay attention to this very carefully. When you are sharing your set with other people, you need to deal with third-party plugins, both instruments and effects. The people you share your set with may not have your same set of plugins. And if they try and open that particular set, they'll get a message saying that they don't have them, and that track will not play if it's an instrument, and it will sound different if it's an effect. So I'd like to show you 3 different techniques for solving this. And the first one is easy, and the second 2 are a little more involved, but worth the time and effort if you can get your brain around them. So here's the first one. This particular track has an instrument rack that actually is based around electric, which is in fact a Ableton Suite effect, but for our purposes, I'm going to pretend that this is a third-party effect. Or, in another way of thinking about it, maybe you're sharing it with somebody who doesn't have Suite, and so they won't be able to play back this track. Notice that the track is still MIDI, and as it plays, there's quite a bit of automation going on, but that's okay. We can take care of that. The simplest way to deal with this kind of a situation is to simply go freeze track, which will convert this track to audio, but leave it in a state that can be reverted. Now you might think that just simply by freezing the track, you could now share this with somebody, but it's not true. The instance of this plugin is still there, and if you shared this set with the frozen track, the person on the other end would still get the message about them not having this particular plugin, and it would not work. So you need to take it one step further and go to Flatten. And now you have a track that is the audio version of the MIDI that we had previously. Straightforward, but they can never get back to any of the plugins that you had on that track. So I'm actually going to show you a method that allows for a bit more flexibility. I'm going to undo twice. And here we are back to the way it was originally. So here's the second technique. The first thing I'm going to do is duplicate the track. You can highlight the track and do Command D, or you can simply right-click on the track and say duplicate, or you can use the edit menu. And now I've got an exact copy of this track. Now what I'm going to do is on the original track, delete all of the plugins. So now all that's left is any MIDI plugins. There's a pitch plugin here that transposes the whole track down 2 semitones, and the instrument sitting here on the track. And now I'm going to freeze and flatten this. And flatten. And there we have it. Now we just have the audio made from the instrument itself minus any plugins. But I have this backup copy of the track. So I'm going to go over to there and I'm going to highlight all of these. And I'm going to copy and paste all of these plugins onto the previous version of the track. And you'll notice that the automation transfers over. So now the audio that's been flattened and frozen plays through the same lineup of plugins that the original instrument did, and it should sound exactly the same. You can now, on this secondary track, either delete the track entirely, or if you think it might be useful, you could mute the track and recolor it to that gray color. And this just simply lets the person at the other end know that this is the original track with plugins, and that if they don't have that plugin, it won't be useful to them. But if they do have the plugin, if you're sharing it with somebody, maybe they have Ableton Suite in this case, they could go back and change actual notes or settings on the electric And that can be really handy when you're mixing or remixing or editing or whatever it is that you're going to have somebody do with you. So this is a much better way of working because it allows you the flexibility of actually being able to work with the plugins that you do own while eliminating the plugin that they may not have. And by keeping the second copy of the track around, there's even some backwards compatibility here. The third technique is simply a variation on this last one. It's not that different. So if you can get that concept, this one's going to be pretty much the same. But I just want to show you an example. I'm going to undo a whole bunch of times here till we're back to our original. There we go. Let's say that there was a third-party plugin, maybe this micro warmer on the track. This is a PSP compressor plugin. And so now I've got a MIDI effect, an instrument, an Ableton effect, a third-party effect, and then a bunch more Ableton effects. So now I've got 2 third-party plugins on this track that I need to deal with. Logically, it would be really easy to just take the third-party plugin, move it closer to the instrument like so, and then do the same technique I just showed you of duplicating the track, freezing and flattening the entire track without the Ableton effects. But it would actually sound different to reorder these plugins in that way. So you really can't do that. So the only possibility here is something like this. I'm going to duplicate the track. I'm going to go to the original track and delete all the plugins after the third-party plugin. So I'm going to lose the ability here to adjust this EQ any further because it's not going to get transferred from the other track. But it's a small price to pay. I will get to work with everything after that. And I'm going to freeze. And flatten. And now from the duplicated track, I'm going to grab everything after the micro warmer. And I'm going to copy it and paste it onto the flattened track. So now I have the audio of the instrument plus the EQ and a vintage warmer all flattened, and then all of the plugins that follow. If your third-party effect is at the end of your signal chain, obviously you've got to flatten the whole thing. There's no way around that. But there you have it, 3 slightly different techniques for getting rid of third-party plugins in your set. And again, you'd want to recolor and mute any duplicates that you kept around. Another thing you can do is edit the text info. And this is not usually known to a lot of people, but you can actually save notes on a particular track. So for this one, you might leave a message saying, leave muted, or swap in place of the frozen version, right? So that whoever was working with this track would see that there was some relationship to this one above it. You could put notes in here like, let's make the snare louder, or I don't really like this reverb, maybe there should be another one. Anything you like. It's just a way to communicate with people about specific elements, and it's actually quite handy. Okay, now that you've gotten that far, it's time to collect all and save. This is a very important step that will take all other files from anywhere else on your hard drive and save them into this folder. You'll remember when we created this folder that there was no samples folder initially because it was still pointing to the previous folder. Well, this is going to remedy all that, right? If you don't collect all and save, all of those samples will not be in this folder, and when you share it, they'll go missing. So this should be done towards the end of this process just to make sure that all of your frozen, flattened files are collected into one location. And it asks you here which files you'd like to copy from elsewhere. And I always tell people to check all of these boxes. They should all say yes, even the user library, because you never know, someone's got a slightly different version of the user library than you do. I hit OK. And all of these files are copied from wherever they were on my hard drive into this new project folder, into the samples folder. And that includes your reference tracks that you may have dragged in here and your reference mix. Excellent. Now the size of this folder just got a lot bigger. And you'll notice that from the previous set, he had a folder called clips and another one called Ian Gallagher, the identifiers. And those are copied over as well. It's perfectly fine. You could throw these into the samples folder for cleanliness if you really wanted to, and there'd be a bit of reconnecting that you'd have to do, but that's fine. It's not a big deal. It's worth mentioning that we are not going to make a live pack out of this project, nor are we going to zip this project. Because we will be sharing this particular folder structure via Dropbox, both of those schemes, while saving space, would actually prevent us from being able to edit the project as it stands on the other end. And that's what we want. So we're actually going to just put this whole folder structure into Dropbox as is. The last thing I'm going to have you do is also very important, to keep your folder size at a bare minimum. And especially given that this is a copy of your own project, it's perfectly okay to do this. I'm going to head over to the File Manager, which brings this up, and into Manage Project. And this process will get rid of any unused files that may be sitting in the folder. And right now you're seeing 2 files are not used by any of its live sets, live clips, or presets. And that's just because I made those frozen files and then undid them. So if I hit show over in the browser, you'll see these 2 frozen tracks show up. And they're not of any use to me, so I'm just going to highlight them and delete them. Great. And you can do that for recordings, consolidated, other files, whatever shows up in here. Those are simply files that are no longer used on the timeline and don't need to be included. And that will save you upload and download time. And sometimes these can be very large files. One final thing I'd like to mention before we leave the live environment is that some third-party instruments and effects sometimes have a problem translating to another user. Sometimes you'll save your set and send it off to somebody with the same plugin that you have. Let's say it's Native Instruments Massive. And yet when they open it on their end, the patch doesn't actually show up for some reason. Sometimes there's a version incompatibility. And so the only way to transfer your patch to somebody else is to actually physically go into the track that contains it and export the patch manually. So in this case, let's imagine that we had Massive on this particular track. It's the one we used before. And I'm going to drop it in here. And it's going to replace my previous instrument. But let's say I had a particular preset maybe that the other person didn't have, or you've made something that you really like. You can do a save as in just about any plugin that you have. And what I'd recommend that you do is go into your project folder, make yourself a new folder called Patches, and save that particular patch in there. And I would save it with the track name. In this case, it was Keys Little Mellow 1, and then the name of the patch itself would also be handy to have in there. Just the more information, the better. And hit save. And that way, looking at the folder here, I've now got a patches folder, and this is called Little Mellow 1. And this patch could be loaded into Massive on the other end, just to be doubly sure. So if you really want to be thorough, you can go through and export all your third-party patches into a folder, just for redundancy. Okay, to finish, let's talk about Dropbox. Dropbox is a very handy way to share files between people. I think it's the preferred method right now. So I'm going to first make a folder in my Dropbox. I'm going to call it, again, your name. In this case, I'm pretending to be Ian Gallagher again. Artist name. And I'm going to drag my project folder that I've worked very hard to make conform with all those various rules into this folder. And now I'm going to share this top level folder. Why wouldn't I just share the project folder? For several reasons. One, you might eventually have multiple project folders in here. And rather than share them all separately, let's share them all at once. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to right-click on the top level folder and not share Dropbox link. This actually will give people who you share it with the opportunity to download your folder, but they won't see any changes and they won't be able to make changes to it. Instead, share this folder, which will open up a web page where it asks you to enter the email address of the people that you'd like to share this folder with. So you go ahead and do that. You can add a little message here about what you're sharing or what you'd like people to do with it once they have it. And this will add it to their Dropbox. Once they join the folder, they will see your project folder inside of it. And if you continue to add any files to this folder, they will see those as well. Now here's some important Dropbox etiquette. Naming your folder with your name and your project name or your artist name really helps. If you name it with the name of the person you're going to share it with, that doesn't help them very much. That helps you. And what you want is for it to be clear to everybody who's going to be joining this folder. You want to name this folder once and then not rename it. Very important. If you rename the folder that you're actually sharing, it unshares it from everybody else who's already joined it. So be very clear about what you want to name it before you go sharing it. Also, don't delete this folder or anything inside the folder that you don't want to also delete from everybody else who you've shared it with's computers. My advice is to create this folder and then leave it there until the project is done, until everybody has finished the project or you've gotten the mix review or the notes or whatever reason that you've shared it with somebody. And when you're completely done with it, you can view this folder on Dropbox. And then when you're done, you can unshare the folder by going to sharing options and choosing unshare. In this case, I don't have anybody actually joining this folder yet, so I can't unshare it. But let's pretend with this folder, there's 2 people on this folder, and I'm going to unshare this folder, and that would kick everybody else out. It wouldn't remove the folders from their Dropbox. It would just prevent any further updates from happening. Excellent. So there you have it. May seem like an awful lot to do before you can share a particular project, but honestly, if you get into the habit of doing these things as a matter of course in all your sets, they'll become second nature to you, and this whole process will speed up dramatically. These are good best practices for working with sets in general, I think. So happy music making and happy sharing.